The 38th floor boardroom is a fortress of glass and steel, charts and graphs flickering across screens like digital ghosts. Monica Sterling sits at the head, radiant, powerful, and confident in her $900 million vision. The directors nod, the air thick with expensive cologne and imminent victory. At the far end sits David Kim, a quiet single dad in a worn suit, clutching a secret notebook. He raises his hand. "We need to re-examine the costs," he says. Monica laughs. "David, we're not here for small details." 20 minutes later, an urgent email hits. The risk numbers shift violently. The air turns to ice. David Kim is 44 years old, and his life is a delicate, often exhausting balance of high-stakes logistics and the chaotic beauty of an elementary school schedule. He is a single father to 10-year-old Ella, a bright girl whose school is located just 4 blocks away from the towering corporate headquarters of Sterling Global. While the executives around him spend their evenings at gala dinners, drinking vintage wine and discussing disruptive innovations, David spends his evenings at a small kitchen table, helping with long division and packing school lunches with precisely cut apple slices. He is the regional operations manager, a title that sounds important on LinkedIn, but in the hierarchy of this boardroom makes him feel almost invisible. The morning of the meeting began like any other for David. A frantic search for a missing sneaker, a quick braid for Ella's hair, and a frantic dash to the school gates. He arrived at the office with a faint coffee stain on his tie and a backpack full of technical manuals. To the sleek, polished executives in the lobby, he looked like a man out of time, a relic of the manual labor era. But David didn't care. He was focused on the data. He had spent the previous night, long after Ella had fallen asleep, running stress tests on the proposed integration models. What he found kept him awake until dawn. David isn't a silver-tongued Ivy League graduate who spent his 20s networking in Manhattan lofts. He is a man of the floor. He started his career 20 years ago on the loading docks of a shipping yard, physically moving boxes, managing inventory in sweltering warehouses, and learning the language of the supply chain through sweat and calloused hands. He has 18 years of hard-earned, practical experience in the trenches. He knows how trucks move in the freezing rain when the GPS fails. He knows exactly how warehouse management systems crash during a sudden power surge. He understands the why behind the numbers, the human and mechanical reality that the executives only see as clean, colored lines on a PowerPoint slide. Today, the company is on the precipice of its largest acquisition in history, a $900 million buyout of Nexus Logic, a trendy tech startup that promises to revolutionize the industry. The goal is ambitious: to integrate a high-end, proprietary AI system into their existing legacy logistics network. Monica Sterling, the 39-year-old CEO, is the primary architect of this deal. She is young, sharp, and intensely decisive, having inherited the company's ambition but not its patience. She wants to be the first global leader to fully automate the entire supply chain from end to end. To her, this deal is her legacy. It is the moment she moves from being an heir to being a visionary. Anyway, David was invited to this meeting not to provide strategic input, but because he is the one who will eventually have to implement the system on the ground. He has spent the last week buried in the technical appendices, the hundreds of pages of fine print that the legal team skimmed and the board ignored. While everyone else was mesmerized by the projected growth curves and the glossy marketing materials of Nexus Logic, David was looking at the API integration protocols and the hardware compatibility charts. He noticed a fundamental flaw in the risk assumptions, a tiny, almost imperceptible gap between the AI's theoretical processing speed and the physical, mechanical reality of the aging sorting machines in their primary hubs. The room began to fill with directors, each carrying an air of self-importance that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the space. They spoke in buzzwords: hyper-growth, algorithmic optimization, and synergistic scaling. David listened, his notebook open to a page titled Real-World Limitations. He saw the disconnect immediately. They were talking about a digital heaven, but he lived in a mechanical reality where belt drives snapped and sensors got covered in dust. He felt a heavy weight in his chest. He knew that if he didn't speak up, thousands of workers would bear the brunt of a failed rollout, and the company he had served for nearly 2 decades would be crippled. But in this room, no one is talking about machines. They are talking about market dominance and industry-leading disruption. The atmosphere is celebratory, bordering on arrogant. The deal is spoken of as a fait accompli, a done deal just waiting for a celebratory dinner. David sits quietly at the very end of the long mahogany table, his pen hovering. He watches as the leadership team laughs and toasts to a future built on assumptions. He knows he is the operational guy in a room full of dreamers, but his military-like focus on the details is screaming at him. He knows that visionaries often trip over the small stones they refuse to look at, and this stone looked like it could sink the entire company. The meeting enters its second hour, and the heat in the room is rising along with the projections. Monica is showing a slide that predicts a 40% increase in efficiency within the first quarter of the merger. The directors are beaming, already calculating their year-end bonuses. The synergy seems perfect on paper. The screens display a map of the world, with Sterling global hubs glowing in a futuristic neon blue. It's a vision of perfection, a seamless web of intelligence. David watches the slide, his eyes moving over the cost absorption column. It doesn't add up. The numbers assume a 99.9% uptime, which is statistically impossible in the environments he manages. He clears his throat, the sound small against the confident hum of the room. Monica, I've looked at the cost absorption rate for the legacy hardware integration in the Midwest and Southern hubs. If we switch to this AI overnight, the legacy servers won't just slow down. They will bottleneck at the port level. The projected costs in this slide don't account for a total hardware overhaul, which could cost upwards of $50 million before we even see a single automated package move. Monica stops mid-sentence, her laser pointer hovering over a graph. The room goes silent. She doesn't look at the data on her screen. She looks directly down the long table at David. David, she says, her voice carrying a patronizing edge. We've had senior consultants from the Big Four review this model for over 6 months. They've assured us the transition is seamless. Their software is designed to bridge the gap between old and new systems. She looks around the room, inviting the others to share in her amusement. I appreciate your frontline perspective, but we aren't talking about fixing a jammed conveyor belt here. We are talking about the next generation of logistics. A senior director, a man who hasn't stepped into a warehouse in 15 years, adds with a sigh, let's not slow down the momentum for a maintenance concern, David. We have a global press release scheduled for Monday. We are looking at the big picture here. Details are for the implementation phase, not the boardroom. David tries again, his voice steady but insistent. He is thinking of the workers in the Ohio hub who struggle with the current 10-year-old servers. He can almost see their frustrated faces as the screens freeze and the lines back up. An operational fear is actually a mathematical certainty in this case, sir. If you look at section 4.2, paragraph C of the Nexus Logic contract regarding integration liability, it's worded very vaguely. It suggests that any failure during the bridge phase is our financial responsibility, not theirs. We are essentially giving them a blank check to fail. Monica lets out that laugh again, a soft, melodic, but utterly dismissive sound that makes everyone else in the room feel like they are part of an exclusive club that David hasn't been invited to join. David, really? We're not here for small operational fears or to worry about a few old servers in Ohio. We're building the future of global commerce. Maybe, she smirks, tilting her head. You're just too used to the old manual way of doing things. It can be hard to let go of the past when it's all you know. The room erupts in quiet, sophisticated laughter. The directors exchange glances, amused by the little guy trying to play at the big table. David doesn't blush. He doesn't shrink in his seat. He doesn't get angry. He has faced much worse on the loading docks at 3 a.m. in a blizzard, dealing with angry drivers and broken hydraulic lifts. He simply takes a slow sip of water, opens his notebook, and makes a single note in black ink. Assumption of risk, unverified. Potential hardware failure, imminent. Trust levels, critical low. 15 minutes pass. Monica is nearing the end of her presentation, detailing the branding changes for the new entity. The atmosphere is back to its celebratory peak. They are discussing the font for the new logo, whether it should be aggressive blue or visionary silver. David feels a strange sense of detachment. He looks at his watch. Ella would be in her art class right now. He thinks about how much more productive her art class is than this billion-dollar ego trip. Then a sharp, synchronized chime echoes through the room as notifications hit every laptop and smartphone on the table simultaneously. It's the digital sound of a dream dying. It's an urgent priority email from the chief legal officer, who is currently at the Nexus Logic headquarters for the final document review. The partner firm on the other side of the deal has just sent a last-minute, non-negotiable addendum. They are demanding an immediate change to the liability clauses for what they call real-world integration costs. Suddenly, the startup isn't willing to guarantee the seamless transition their sales team had promised. Their engineers have realized that Sterling Global's hardware is even more outdated than they thought, and they want the company to bear the full financial burden of any system failures or hardware fires during the AI rollout. They've caught wind of the very bottleneck David had warned about, and they are scrambling to protect themselves. The risk numbers on Monica's screen don't just shift, they explode. The potential cost of the deal, the hidden liability, just increased by an estimated $80 to $100 million. Monica stares at the email, her face losing its color. The laughter dies instantly. The room becomes so silent that the rhythmic hum of the building's ventilation sounds like a roar. Everyone looks at Monica, and Monica, for the first time today, looks at David with the expression that is part shock and part dawning realization. If you believe that a small detail can sink a billion-dollar ship, subscribe to see the moment the boardroom goes silent and the real power shifts. The silence in the 38th floor boardroom is heavy, suffocating. Monica Sterling stares at the red urgent flag on her screen as if it's a personal betrayal. She looks at her CFO, who is now frantically typing on his calculator, his brow furrowed in a way that suggests the math is no longer working in their favor. The air of arrogant confidence that had defined the morning has been replaced by a cold, sharp panic. We need a full, line-by-line audit of the financial model and the hardware compatibility reports, Monica commands, her voice tight, the smooth edges of her professional persona beginning to fray. Now, I want to know exactly how much this addendum is going to cost us over the next 3 fiscal years. How did our consultants miss this? The CFO looks up, his face pale. Monica, our current models were based on the assumption that Nexus Logic would handle the server bridge. If we have to rebuild the infrastructure ourselves, we're looking at a total project cost overrun of nearly 15%. The investors will crucify us. We were supposed to announce this with a win, not a debt warning. David doesn't wait to be asked. He doesn't wait for permission. He stands up from the far end of the table, his movements calm and deliberate. He walks to the front of the room, the sound of his shoes on the carpet the only noise in the space. The directors watch him as if he's a ghost coming to life. He quietly unplugs the CEO's sleek tablet and plugs his own ruggedized, sticker-covered laptop, decorated with Ella's Super Dad stickers, into the projector. He doesn't say, "I told you so." He doesn't mention the laughter or the dismissive smirks. He doesn't even look at the directors who had just mocked him. He just presents the data. I took the liberty of running a stress test simulation based on the hardware specs in our southern and Midwest hubs. David begins, his voice clear and professional. He brings up a series of complex diagrams that show the actual data flow during a peak season load. The AI system Nexus Logic is selling us requires a minimum data throughput that our 2014-era servers simply cannot handle. Here's the bottleneck point. He points to a glowing red intersection on the screen that looks like a digital heart attack. The issue isn't just the software, David explains, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who has actually touched the machinery. It's the physical interface. We are trying to run a Ferrari engine through a garden hose. The friction alone will cause the legacy API to crash every 4 hours. I contacted our regional leads in Ohio and Texas this morning. They confirmed that the server racks in those locations are already running at 85% capacity just to handle the current load. Adding the Nexus AI without a hardware refresh is suicide. He shows the operational reality that no consultant from the Big Four bothered to investigate because they never actually visited the hubs. He presents his analysis of the company's previous 3 minor software integrations, showing a consistent 22% lag time between software launch and hardware stabilization. He provides granular data on the actual costs of retraining 5,000 floor-level employees, not the digital training the startup promised, but the hands-on, 3-week intensive required for people who aren't digital natives. Then there's the downtime, David continues, switching to a financial impact slide that he built at 2 a.m. If the sorting machines in Ohio go down for even 6 hours during the AI bridge phase, we lose $4 million in shipping penalties per day. Based on the new liability clause they just sent, we can't sue them for that. We have to eat it. Over the projected 6-month rollout, that's a potential loss of nearly $200 million in the worst-case scenario. These aren't the kind of disruptive numbers that look good in a press release, but they are the numbers that determine whether a company survives or goes bankrupt. When added together, David's data changes the entire forecast. The return on investment, ROI, that everyone was so intoxicated by drops from a glowing 15% to a dismal, dangerous 4%. The CFO stops typing. He leans back, looking at David's screen with a mixture of shock and reluctant respect. He looks at Monica and shakes his head slowly. He's right, Monica. If we sign this deal with their new terms, we aren't buying a future-proof startup. We're buying a massive, long-term debt that will drain our cash reserves for a decade. We'd be better off burning the $900 million in the parking lot. David, why didn't the consultants see this? David looks the CFO in the eye. Because they asked the engineers at Nexus Logic. I asked the mechanics in Ohio. There's a difference. The board members, the very men and women who were snickering at David's small details just 30 minutes ago, are now leaning forward, hanging on his every word. They are asking questions about server racks, latency, and manual overrides, terms they treated with contempt earlier. They aren't looking at him as the single dad from operations anymore. They are looking at him as the only person in the entire organization who actually knows how the business works. One director even takes out a pen to take notes on David's hardware suggestions. Monica sits perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her. She is looking at the screen, then at David. She sees the data, but more importantly, she sees the man. She realizes that her vision was built on a foundation of glossy brochures and expensive lunches, while David's reality was built on the cold, hard facts of the physical world. She realizes she was about to march the company off a cliff because she was too proud to listen to the person who actually knew where the edge was. She feels a flush of embarrassment for her earlier laughter, a sensation she hasn't felt in years. The negotiation with Nexus Logic will have to be completely restructured, or the deal, her legacy, will have to be scrapped entirely. The power in the room has shifted, and it didn't move to another executive. It moved to the end of the table. Monica Sterling is many things: ambitious, sometimes arrogant, and intensely focused on her image. But she is not a fool. She is a leader for a reason, and she recognizes a sinking ship when the water's at her knees. She doesn't panic, and she doesn't try to hide her mistake. She does something even more difficult. She pivots. She picks up the conference phone and calls the Nexus Logic CEO, a 30-year-old tech wonderkin named Julian, who is currently waiting for the victory call. The directors watch in rapt attention as she puts the call on speaker. But the call he gets is not what he expected. Monica doesn't use the script her consultants wrote. She uses David's data. She uses the specific hardware failure points David identified. She quotes the exact latency figures David calculated. Her voice is like steel, cutting through Julian's rehearsed excitement. "Julian," she says, her eyes fixed on David's projector screen, "we've just completed a deep dive operational audit of your integration protocols. Your new liability addendum is a non-starter. In fact, based on our hardware stress tests, your seamless AI is going to cause a catastrophic bottleneck in our Midwest hubs within 48 hours of launch. You knew this, didn't you? That's why you sent the addendum at the 11th hour." There is a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Julian tries to deflect, mentioning the Big Four consultants again, his voice cracking slightly. Monica, our engineers assured us the consultants didn't check the physical server specs in Ohio. Monica cuts him off. We did. Now here is the new deal. We are stripping $80 million off the purchase price to cover our hardware upgrades. Furthermore, we are implementing a risk-sharing integration model. If your system fails to meet the promised efficiency benchmarks in the first 6 months, you forfeit 20% of your stock payout. If you believe your AI is as good as you say it is, you should have no problem betting on it. Otherwise, we walk and we release our audit findings to the press. The partners at Nexus Logic are trapped. They had assumed that Sterling Global's leadership was too high level to catch the technical bait and switch. They figured Monica was too focused on the PR win to care about the nuts and bolts. Faced with David's undeniable granular data, they have no choice but to retreat. After 4 hours of intense back-and-forth negotiation, they agree to the new, much safer terms. The deal is signed 2 days later. It's not the $900 million disruption Monica had dreamed of for her Instagram feed. It's a much smarter, more sustainable $820 million partnership. The news cycle focuses on the unprecedented operational safeguards Monica implemented, further boosting her reputation as a meticulous leader. After the final signatures are dry and the lawyers have cleared out, Monica asks David to stay behind. The boardroom is empty now, the massive screens dark. The sun is setting over the city, casting long orange shadows across the mahogany table. Why didn't you react? Monica asks, leaning against the table, looking exhausted but genuinely curious. When I laughed at you, when the entire board mocked your concerns, why didn't you defend your ego? Why didn't you get angry? David is quietly packing his notebook and his old laptop into his bag. He thinks about Ella, who is probably waiting for him at the school's aftercare program right now, probably showing a teacher a new drawing. Because data doesn't need a reaction to be true, Monica, he says calmly, his voice as steady as it was during the storm. The numbers were going to speak for me sooner or later. My job isn't to be liked by the board. My job is to make sure this company is still healthy and profitable when my daughter Ella graduates from college. Ego is a luxury I can't afford as a father. I've learned that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one with the answers. Monica looks at him, really seeing the man behind the worn suit for the first time. She realizes that true power isn't about who has the loudest laugh, the sharpest suit, or the most followers. It's about who has the clearest, most honest view of the truth and the courage to stay silent until the truth is needed. She feels a profound sense of gratitude, and for the first time in years, she feels like she can actually trust someone in this building. The acquisition of Nexus Logic is completed and the integration begins. It isn't seamless. There are hardware glitches and server spikes, just as David predicted. But because of the risk-sharing agreement he insisted on, the startup's engineers work around the clock to fix them at their own expense. The company survives the transition without losing a single cent in projected quarterly profit. Monica doesn't just give David a standard year-end bonus. She does something that shocks the entire corporate structure. She creates a brand new executive position, Chief of Strategic Operations. She moves David's office from the basement-level operations floor to the 38th floor right next to hers. She ensures his office has a view of the park, where he can sometimes see the school buses dropping off kids. David accepts the promotion, but he does so with a single, non-negotiable condition: a flexible, family-first schedule. He refuses to attend any meeting after 2:30 p.m. that isn't a genuine emergency, so he can pick up Ella from school every single day. He makes it clear that his priorities will never shift, no matter how high his title becomes. Monica agrees without a moment's hesitation. In fact, she goes further. She implements a new Kim rule for all board meetings. No strategic vision is allowed to be approved without a ground truth audit from the operations team. The culture of the company shifts fundamentally, away from growth at any cost and toward excellence through precision. The snickering in the halls about maintenance stops. A few months later, at another high-level board meeting, a young, arrogant consultant tries to dismiss a warehouse manager's concern about a new packaging material. He lets out a small, condescending laugh, thinking it will please the CEO. Monica stops him instantly. The room goes ice cold. "We don't laugh at the details in this room anymore," she says, her voice echoing with an authority that no one dares to challenge. She looks over at David, who is sitting right next to her, his notebook open and a small frame photo of Ella on his desk. David simply nods. The consultant turns a deep shade of red and immediately begins apologizing. As David walks out of the building that afternoon to meet Ella, he isn't thinking about the multi-million-dollar merger or his new executive title. He's thinking about the strawberry ice cream Ella requested for her good grade on her math test. He sees her running toward him, her backpack bouncing, her face lit up with a smile that matters more than any stock price. He knows that his silence in that first meeting wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate sign of strength. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He just needed to be right. The laughter at the beginning of the journey didn't make him smaller. It only made the truth of his experience louder when the world finally caught up to it. He takes Ella's hand, and as they walk toward the ice cream shop, he knows he's exactly where he's supposed to be. If you believe that real-world experience and the quiet truth are more powerful than any corporate ego, subscribe for more stories of the little guy winning big, and leave a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated because you cared about the details?